Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Thank you very much for making time to join us at the Africa-China Center for Policy and Advisory, the ACCPA, for this very important discussion as it pertains to Africa's engagement with China. Of course, for those of you that are joining us for the first time, we are a policy think tank headquartered in Accra, Ghana. We have teams across multiple countries on the continent where we're leading the policy shaping agenda of the continent of Africa as far as our engagement with China is concerned. So we involve in researching, producing knowledge, co-convening platforms, both in person and virtually, just like we're doing here today, as well as engaging other partners around the world. Across Europe, America, China, and of course on the continent itself. And we've been privileged to have gotten the chance to work on multiple projects and programs that we believe it's finding its way to shape Africa's policy dynamics when it comes to engagement with China. And what is more interesting about what we do is that we are predominantly an African-led research team. So we get to give in on the ground perspective, lived experience perspective to the work that we do. And so we are very much open to partnership. So if you're joining us for the first time and you think whatever you're doing at this stage could align with what we are doing, of course, we welcome the opportunity to engage further and have a discussion with you to see where we can collaborate. Above all, I want to welcome everyone to today's very important discussion. And so I will take us through how the process is going to be for the next 1 hour 15 minutes tops. We're going to have 3 sessions. So the first session, we have a keynote speaker. Then the second session, we're going to have a plenary discussion with our panelists. We're going to have 3 panelists. And then there will be a Q&A session where all of you who have joined us will come in. I believe the topic that we're going to discuss here today, it's a breaking story. I believe almost all of us who have joined this dialogue might have come across it one way or the other and have your own ideas, own perspective, and we welcome you. We'll get a chance to ask questions to our panelists so that we can get their perspective as well. You can also decide to write in the form of a comment. Again, we'll drop our emails, in the chat box. So in case you want to reach out after the session, then we'll give it a chance to also reach out to us so we can have further discussion on this very important topic. So without wasting my time, we're going to go straight into what we are here. But way of background, of course, this is a policy dialogue that we are doing. It's part of a broader project that we are doing regarding trade, Africa-China trade policies and programs. And of course, as we are aware, about 2 weeks ago, which is on May 1st, we all saw the full implementation of what we all know as a zero-tariff policy by the People's Republic of China for all 53 countries in Africa that have diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. And so as a policy think tank, of course, we know that this has a far-reaching implications for the African continent, especially when we look at our own ambitions in terms of trade, in terms of industrialization, in terms of labor, a host of things, right? Both at the national level, at the regional level, at the continental level. Okay, so what we are seeking to do today is to get perspective from our resource persons on where they sit, what they've looked at, and what they think about this policy. From the Chinese perspective, from the African perspective, which is very important because we are talking about the 2 regions at this stage. And of course, this is the first of the series that we are doing. We hope to co-create other platforms, both in person, of course, virtually, to discuss this very important policy as we've come to know for instance, May 1st. So what we are going to do that at this stage, I'm going to introduce our keynote speaker. And after the keynote speech, of course, we will hope that you could stay and join us for the panel discussion. If not, that's fair. And then after that, we have the panel discussion and the Q&A. Please, we want to get you involved. We want to hear from you. So I'm sure most of us are familiar with the Zoom app. There's a Q&A button on the Zoom, whether you're using mobile or laptop or anything, you can see the Q&A. That's what we are going to use. So if you have any questions or comments, please, we welcome them there, even as we start with the keynotes addressed by our keynote speaker. So briefly about keynote speaker. So Professor Xiaoyang Tang. So he is the chair and a professor in the Department of International Relations at the Tsinghua University, which is, of course, a prestigious university in the world, not just in China. His research interests include political philosophy, China's engagement in developing countries, and global modernization process. He is the author of Co-Evolutionary Pragmatism, Approaches and Impact of China-Africa Economic Cooperation, and has published extensively on Belt and Road Initiative. He used to be the deputy director for Carnegie's Tsinghua Center for Global Policy. Previously, he also worked at the International Food Policy Research Institute in Washington, D.C., and as a consultant for the World Bank, UNDP, USAID. He completed his PhD in the philosophy department at the New School for Social Research in New York. He earned his MA in philosophy from Freiburg University in Germany and his BA in business management from Fudan University in Shanghai, also another prestigious university in terms of global influence. So, ladies and gentlemen, at this stage, of course, we'll do the keynote speech first, and before I introduce our panelists. We have Professor Xiaoyang Tan, Professor Tan for short, to deliver the next 15 or so minutes, a keynote on what he thinks, because he has an extensive experience working across Africa. Of course, I recently missed meeting him in Accra when he was here for another project, I believe, but we are fortunate to have him here today, and we're very much excited to hear from him. So, Professor Tan, please, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Frimpong, for inviting me to this significant event. And thank you so much for the kind introduction. And I really feel honored to be with so many distinguished panelists and to join you to talk about this influential policy of zero tariff for all 53 African countries. Actually, although it's a trade policy, but I would say this is the first political action gesture, and its political significance is more than its economic significance, at least in the short term, because this trade policy, first, it's not a new thing. We know that the U.S. has this AGOA for the African countries, and also the European Union has the EBA, everything but arms, also for most developing countries. But however, a very important point is this EBA and AGOA, they have the conditions attached. So the US and Europe, they often use this trade policy as some instrument and saying, you need to follow like some election or some governance requirement. Otherwise, then I will withdraw that. So they actually give it as some like mercy, as a charity, policy, but also then require something in return. So like what happened in Ethiopia just several years ago when they actually had ethnic conflicts, which is already quite unfortunate. But then the U.S. also then added the pain by canceling their AGOA treatment so that they actually fall into an even more miserable situation. But China actually, when give this policy to all the 53 countries, that's without conditionality, that's in line with China's non-interference policy. As long as you recognize one China without like interfering China's own domestic policy and saying there are two Chinas, then China think you are friends, and China will give that zero tariff to all the countries which recognize this basic policy. And the second is also China, actually, when we look back, China actually had this like 95% of tariff-free imports as early as 2009 for the already for Africa, and then 98% as around 2021. And so this we can see actually for most countries they already and by 2024 it was a zero tariff for all the least developed countries. There were actually 33 in Africa who already enjoyed this zero tariff since 2024. But this it was or also like a good policy, very welcomed. But however, there was still around 20 countries who didn't receive this zero tariff, or actually at the from 2009 to 2024, between these 15 years, there was still like a 5% of the imports which didn't enjoy the zero tariff. And now this is actually the real difference in this new policy. So about this 5% and about these 20 countries, because this actually are critical. First, this 5% of newly added zero tariff imports, they are mainly agriculture imports. So since 2009, because why it took so long to discuss, that's because China was also weak, and China wanted to protect its own farmers when it was still weak. So therefore, then China was very cautious to lift the last 5%, and it took quite a lot of years to evaluate, to see the impacts, and then China now sees actually it's the time to really give more responsibility, to take more responsibility to help Africa's trade and exports more. So this is actually a cautious decision, but it's also very well considered. So I can see actually this new policy, they will have some long-term impact, which I will just say in a moment. But also about this 20 new joined countries which enjoy this zero tariff. These actually are the ones who really actually may benefit a lot from this policy, because the 33 least developed countries, although they also want to export, but actually because of their low development level, it was pretty difficult for them to export. Their industrialization degree was so low that they cannot even properly process the primary goods, or they do not have efficient logistics to organize the exports. But then these new 20 countries, they include Nigeria, Egypt, South Africa, also Ghana, Kenya. All these are like a relatively well better off countries in Africa. They actually, some of them was already exporting to Europe and to the US, like Ghana. Actually, I just visited Ghana last month. I saw a big industry park in Afinia and also in Tema. They actually export a lot to the developed countries. They actually have the capacity of doing this international exports quite easily. And for them, then this zero tariff really make a lot of sense because they can export from the agricultural products like avocado, coffee, and so on, and to also manufactured goods like textile, footwear, and this. And then this is can really become a boost for the 20 this new countries who had this zero tariff policy. And actually, I think that's also China's idea of Africa's industrialization in general. Because these 20 countries which can export to China, they are not just isolated, but actually they when they can export, they actually increase their supply network, supply chain. They will actually get also workers, get their raw materials from neighboring countries. They will share experience with others. So actually, through these 20 better off countries, may I believe this impact will also expand now further to these 33 least developed countries. So help them to get this idea, get the experience, also get the network to export to China. So there will be a spillover impact of these 20 countries. And then furthermore, I believe there will also be a spillover effects between the sectors. To be sure, the first sectors which will benefit from this zero tariff policy, they usually they are agricultural products because that's what actually yeah Chinese market is mostly currently mostly needed. And we also see already examples of fruits, of vegetables or animal products exporting to China. So this is kind of a low-hanging fruits. But that should not be the end. And that's also the difference between China and Europe or the US. Because for Europe and the US, they are just like the consumer markets, and their own like industry or economy, they are highly capital intensive and technology advanced, and they only can enjoy the raw materials from Africa. So that's why even after 20 years of AGOA, actually 80% of AGOA exports, they are actually just resource, this natural resource related commodities, plus other 20%, maybe some labor intensive ones. But actually, China is different because China is not only a consumer market. China itself is the industrial powerhouse of the world. It has a lot of industries. So that's what I actually think the zero tariff from China to Africa, what it may do is actually it will not only encourage in short run this exports of agricultural products, but in the long run, it also then establishes some of this value chain, manufacturing value chain. At least now those countries like in Morocco, in Ghana, Ghana, in Kenya, these countries are already exporting some textile and this industry products. They may also export supply China's industry chain. And while this actually linked this supply chain and like media upstream and downstream producers closer, then this interaction and this linkage of this value chain, they will further then promote value chain expansion in Africa. And then with that, then I would believe actually maybe it will initiate or stimulate some further policy liberalization, because Africa in that connection should not only think about export things to China. That's actually just a one stop. That's just like what we see, or agricultural products or labor intensive. That's just a one shot. But they should actually also think about value chain integration. And the value chain integration actually should be not only like one direction to China gives the zero tariff, but think about facilitation of two-way trade. This actually, there's an example in Vietnam. Vietnam, this country alone, it has with China about 200 billion trade, US dollar trade last year. That's almost two-thirds of Africa's trade with China in total. You can see just this small country have two-thirds, count more than 60% of the trade volume between China and Africa. Why? Because for between Vietnam and China, that's not just a Vietnam export to China, but it's about actually two-way. Actually, it's a deeper value chain integration. And that's what I think maybe in the midterm or in the long run, Africa and China should take advantage of this zero tariff policy as the first step, but then really like do substantial value chain integration so that the trade can become more free, the trade flow, the cash flow, the technology flow, yeah, capital flow, all this can be facilitated. That will actually build a global south common market, build this south, yeah, it really makes this south cooperation becoming successful and effective, especially in this era of deglobalization of tariff king. And I think we are doing something which in another direction, which will be more promising for the global south to develop together. Thank you. Yeah.
Wow, thank you very much, Professor Tan. I think you've really breaking everything down, and I think the keynote that you've given, the insight you've given, will be featured in the discussion that we'll be having. Of course, I mean the background that you've given, given the political undertone of the policy, giving us what makes this policy from a China's perspective a bit distinct, right, from the other trade, arrangement that the continent has with other regions like the AGOA and with Europe. And also, the last part really very on point, talking about how we should not discuss it in a linear sense or in a one-way trade sense where we're just looking at, okay, just what are we going to export to China? What are we going to export to China? But it must be part of a broader, policy changes from the continent perspective on how to build what you describe as a deep, value chain integration, right? And I think we will be able to understand more even from our speakers, the panelists on these very important issues that you've raised. We're very much grateful for sharing your thought and your insight with us. We know that you have a busy schedule, but if you would like to stay on for a bit, that's fair. We would love to have you here so that in case there are any other questions, you'll be able to also chip in and make your opinion also. Thank you very much, Professor Tan. We are grateful for doing this with us. So, ladies and gentlemen, now we'll be heading to the panel discussions, of course. We are very much privileged to have three distinguished individuals with us, and of course, I'm very privileged to have had the opportunity to engage almost all of them. Of course, one is my colleague, and the other two we've met on different platforms, and then we've engaged on different forums as well. So first, I have Professor Wang Jinjie, Jinjie Wang. She is a research professor, National School of Development and Institute of Area Studies at Peking University, and also a deputy director at the Center for African Studies at the same Peking University. Also, we have my friend from South Africa, Mikatekiso Kubayi, is a doctor as well. He is an international affairs and global, expert. I've also known him for quite some time. We've met on a couple of occasions on Africa China programs and projects. Of course, he's very much experienced when it comes to Africa China relations. And of course, my very own colleague, Dr. Rosemary Mnongya, who is a senior research fellow at the ACCPA, also a lecturer at RD University in Tanzania. So, ladies and gentlemen, these are our three panelists that we have to engage with them. So the first part, of course, is going to be me engaging them on a series of questions, and then we'll welcome you questions from the audience. And so we're going to do this for the next 30 or so minutes with them. I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask. Just to know that Mikatekiso has other engagements, so he will leave us along the way. And when it's time, he will prompt me, and I will let all of you know that he will be leaving. So I'm going to start with Professor Wang Jinjie, because of where Professor Tang ended. I still wanted to give you the chance to walk us through a certain journey, right? So, of course, China's decision to implement the zero tariff for the 53 countries that we are discussing, and it's been largely described as a landmark moment in terms of the China-Africa economic relations. But what I want to find out from your perspective, this is going to be your opening remarks, of course. This is an opening remarks kind of session. So you can take your time for the next 3 or 5 minutes just to get your perspective, what is what broader message that this policy send about the future of China-Africa cooperation, and as a Chinese scholar and a researcher, what do you find a bit of interesting from the Chinese policy making perspective, right? I know you're not part of the policy making of China, yes, but I'm sure your work also, one or the other, shapes some of the discussion, because you work extensively on Africa as well, as you are leading the Center for African Studies at the Peking University. So just as your opening remarks, if you don't mind. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Paul. And also thank you, Professor Tang. And every time I listen to Professor Tang's talk, I always learn something, and that's a great talk. And that's actually echoes some of my thoughts as well. So first of all, I want to thank you very much for your center, for your Africa China Center for the policy and anniversary, for inviting me to this very important dialogue, and a great pleasure to join colleagues to discuss China's new zero tariff policy. As Professor Tang just said, China's decision to implement this zero tariff treatment for imports from African countries is a very important policy signal. It's create a wider door for African products to enter the Chinese market. Here are some of my views. I feel it's even more important question for us to answer is whether African countries are ready and able to walk through that door. We see the very potential opportunities. Here are some of my points that we feel there might be opportunity, but might be more things we can done. So first, I think the zero tariff should be understood not only as an opportunity, but also we needed to see opportunity doesn't equal to a development outcome by itself. So the tariff removal can reduce trade costs and improve market access. This is very important. especially for African countries, they seeking diversify exports beyond the traditional commodities. So some sectors may benefit more immediately, such as Professor Tang just also mentioned, like coffee, agricultural products, cocoa, fruits, nuts, seafood, leather products, etc. There are also some growing opportunities in processed agricultural products, right? Green minerals or cultural or creativity products. Yes, we see that kind of possibility if they can meet Chinese market demands. However, when we are looking at the zero tariff alone, it cannot automatically transform Africa's position in global trade. So when we are looking at the trade data in 2025, we see China and Africa trade reached over 300 millions US dollars, and it's a huge year on year up probably 18%. But Africa's trade deficit with China widened to about 100 billion dollars. So it's an increase of over 60%. So Chinese export to Africa grew last year about over 25%. We can double check the data, over about 25%, but Africans export to China increased only probably a little bit over 5%. So you see this reflects a structural imbalance. And as Professor Tang also said, over about 80 or 70% of African exports to are raw materials, right? Crude oil, copper, bauxite. But while imports from China are mainly high value manufactured goods, machinery, electronics, and green technology equipment. Many African countries, they face not only tariff barriers, but also this production side constraints, limited processing capability, weak logistics and high transportation costs, and unstable power supply, fragmented supply chain, and insufficient quality control, and some of the limited access to market information, infrastructure deficiencies, and whatsoever. But we know this kind of barriers are out there. But how can we implement that kind of constraints during this kind of zero tariff policy as partially a zero tariff policy plus the barriers overcoming strategies alongside would be created? That would be very helpful. My second point would be the biggest challenge is not market accessing anymore. Like Professor Tang also said, right, we're all totally open to the market access, but it's the productive readiness. Based on my research on China-Africa cooperation, especially Chinese enterprises, we studied about Chinese enterprises investment in African countries for the past 10 years. We visited industry parks, education sectors, and specifically, I focus on the skill development in Africa. I have found that most difficult bottlenecks is often not lack of opportunity, but lack of the local capacity to convert opportunity into more sustainable industrial upgrading. For example, in the studies of Chinese enterprises in African industries, one reoccurring issues for the past 10 years, every time we visited, we see there's a common issue there. It's the shortage of skilled workers. Compared with 10 years ago, it's much better now, but the middle level technical personnel is still missing. Firms may want to localize production and employment, but they often facing difficulties in recruiting workers with the required technical, managerial, and quality control skills. So these affects the productivity, the product standards, and export competitiveness. This is why I think the zero tariff policy must be connected with the skill formation. So the hardcore of the zero tariff can taking on and also have a sustainable benefit for both parties. So if African countries wanted to use this policy effectively, they need not only exporters, but also trained workers, reliable certification systems, and a local testing laboratories, logistics services, packaging capacities, and digital trading platforms. Those are a great opportunity for Chinese investors to do the investment in the related area, to build up that kind of partnership to help the African partners to have that kind of skill formation. So it's a whole package. So zero tariff is not a policy, it's a whole package. So skill formation is one of the biggest tool can make this policy work. China has already established more than maybe close to 20 Luban workshops across Africa. And then now I know probably 10 more are set to open. So for example, these kind of workshops initiated by Chinese government, they can focus on the vocational training and in high demand sectors, which is related to the zero tariff of each country's comparative advantages, agriculture business, mechanics, electronic workers, and digital technologies, or some green products and agricultures whatsoever. So this is the right direction we can go. But the scale needs to be significantly expanded, and not only maybe Luban workshop is just a case, but based on that kind of a case model, the follow-up implementation of the zero tariff policy needed to have the policy plus skill formation would become a whole package delivered into the China-Africa cooperation. Okay, Paul, let me just stop here to hear other colleagues' insights.
Professor Jinjie, yes, I think it's spot on. I mean, the first issue that we raise is Africa really ready for this kind of policy, right? And of course, as we walk through the fact that, of course, tariffs is access, it's a cost component, right? But that's not the whole picture, right? The host of things, and like you shared from your own experience researching across the continent in terms of what Chinese enterprises are doing and the challenge that they are facing, of course, you can link that to what it means to have the productive capacity to be able to take advantage, right? So, I mean, and that has been one of the key things that we've raised since the policy, discussion came up, right? That we should ask questions beyond just the fact, okay, what can we export to China, right? That's the basic, right? So that you're just thinking about the access, but a host of things that you need to do, and I think rightly so. I mean, the skill gap and how countries should have a very comprehensive approach to this, and an opportunity to scale. And I think it's brilliant. Thank you very much for that first insight. I'll come back to you on the follow-up question, but I'll go to my friend Mikatekiso, who is coming from the perspective of a global affairs geopolitics angle, sort of. So, Mikatekiso, as you heard, Prof. Wang, highlighted the scale as I did describe earlier. But ultimately, we know that beyond the trade itself, as we discussed, development comes at a time of increasing global economic fragmentation, as even Professor Tang mentioned about what other countries have done. And of course, now we know that there's shifting supply chains and renewed competition for influence across the global south. So, from your perspective, how should Africa strategically interpret this moment, right? I mean, I just want to pick your I mean, looking at what's happening around our world today, looking at what this policy is, how should the continent interpret this policy? Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Frimpong, and thank you so much for inviting me to this panel. Good afternoon, colleagues all the way from Johannesburg. It's a very important question, by any country, especially one, the size of the Chinese market, that offers zero tariff access, to African goods, is a major step, and something that ought to be welcome. Let me give you an example. South Africa today, I saw an announcement, just during the week, that South Africa has now overtaken Spain as the world's largest citrus exporter, for instance, right? And you will recall that, on day one, a huge consignment, of citrus, products arrived in China, under the policy, for example. This is just, an example, one example, of the benefits, that can come, from a policy of this nature. But we have to look, beyond this, right? We have to look, beyond this, beyond, purely, the export, of materials, to China, and so on, as Professor Tang, and Professor Wang Jinjie, have already, mentioned. The development of, a much stronger relationship between China, and Africa, augurs well for Africa's ambition, right? To be a lot more self-assertive, to be a lot more, self-reliant, a lot more capable, to absorb future global shocks, such as, what we're experiencing in West Asia, right? Currently, right now. When you have policies of this nature, the assumption, or at least in theory, right, it means you ought to be able to produce more. But when you produce more, you ought to have the ability to innovate in the production styles. You ought to be able to generate at least an interest or some measure of momentum in knowledge production to support that particular sector, right? There are particular what they call multiplier consequences of policies of this nature to support the increased production of the goods that that go to China. So at least Africans ought to be looking at this as an opportunity to develop the capabilities that they need to generate and to support the ambition or the agenda for the self-reliance that many scholars keep talking about. In today's world, I mean, we just had a summit, China, France, Africa, summit the other day, in Kenya. There's a lot of critique, of that, for instance, by the colonial history, etc., etc. But there's talk about the need to build precisely this self-reliance in IT, right? Invest in technological production, innovation, research and development, and that sort of thing, to expand the production ecosystem on the African continent, so that it shifts from being a net consumer of technological products out there, like Prof Jinjie was talking about, but also a contributor to the value chain in high-tech industries. So when you have a partner such as China that comes in and says that, hey, look, we are able to do this for you guys, tariff-free access. Africans should also be saying to China, thank you so very much for partnering with us in this particular fashion, and we would like to take it a step further, and see how much further we can gain access to the value chain, technological value chain, especially given that China is a very large producer of high tech materials, equipment, I mean, it's a leading innovator in in the scientific fields, and so on. I'd like to close with one last point. I often argue with I often propose to colleagues that if you take the example of how the United States developed and many other economies around the world, major economies around the world, they developed because other economies, send in skilled, academics and teachers, researchers, and so on, to go and teach there. To go and build, a knowledge, base there, knowledge pool there, and so on and so forth. For example, you can look at, how the United States built, the railroads, in the 1800s, and so on. The role of, German experts, that went to teach, in U.S. universities in the early days, of their formation, and so on. Africa could also benefit, from quite a bit of that as well. So countries that such as China that have high expertise, in areas, of science, and a whole host of other areas, could, lend a hand, send professors, send, school teachers, send, people to go and, assist, share knowledge, in some of these research centers based on the African continent, to, in help in the same way that, your Korea, emerged, United States emerged, Japan, emerged, and so on, in that particular fashion. These are the sort of things, that, ought to be considered, beyond, the tariff, policy.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mikatekiso. Yes, bringing attention to some of the key things that we should look at. I mean, beyond the trade, the tariff. Yes, and I like the fact that you mentioned about the referencing the Africa Forward Summit, the Africa France event that took place in Nairobi, and the angle that we pick it from that. Hopefully, there could be that cooperation on innovation and technology, which Europe is very much also in there, and of course, even the case of China, what needs to be done, from China's, incoming support in terms of capacity and technical support. I think that's very important. I will come back to you because maybe your time will be short, but I will go to Rosemary first, and I'll come to you before I go to Professor Jinjie. So, Rosemary, I just wanted to find out briefly, as we heard from Professor Jinjie and Mikatekiso, about the scale, the opportunities, the realities surrounding this policy, and how we should look beyond just the market access and look and see other areas that we need. So, from a development and policy perspective, from the work where you are, what do you believe African government might urgently begin doing differently if the continent really wants to take full utilization of this zero tariff window? What must be done urgently, like in the now phase, like looking at the current phase of the policy just as announced and implemented on May 1st? What should be the urgent things on the table of African governments if their thinking is to take full advantage of this policy? Yeah, just briefly. Yeah, sure.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Prof, for this opportunity. I'm happy to be on board with Professor Wang and Professor Tang. As I pursued my PhD in Beijing, China, those were my places where I was visiting most of the time for the conference and everything. So I know them personally, but I don't know if they know me. I'm happy for this. Speaking of this, what the government should be doing as of now, we should shift from the access to the advantage. Now we have access to zero tariff, yes. So our governments need to have a compliance with the non-tariff barriers by treating or by registering into GACC standards and SPS standards of China, so that our products which are being sent from Africa, they enter to the Chinese supermarkets without any restrictions. Also, we should have this 2-year window starting for the 29 the least developed countries. We should use this preferential window by building permanent industrial capacities. And I'm happy that Professor Wang mentioned of the making our youth or anybody in the export area skilled. And I'm happy that in my university, Arid University, we have a Luban workshop. And currently we have that relationship with China, and we are going to build a college for making our youth skilled, so that we tap into this opportunity very well. That is from the angle of Tanzania, using the Lubam workshop for making our youth skilled, for that you can. So also on the other side, I can advise, or I can ask our governments to use the African Continental Free Trade Area very well, like Tanzanian cotton can be used by Ethiopian garment industry. So, and then after that, we can have a duty-free entry to China. So we collaborate inside our continent. The 53 countries in the African continent can collaborate using the in African Continental Free Trade area, so that we can grasp that opportunity. And also we can focus on the production capacity cooperation. For example, in my country, Tanzania, we have special economic zones, so that we focus, for example, instead of exporting the raw fruit avocados to China, now we can process the fruits, and then we can export them as avocado oil. Instead of exporting the sesame seeds, now we can process them through our special economic zones. Those industries can process the agricultural products into sesame oil, so that we add value to our products, and then we bridge through that. We can bridge the gap which is there from $100 billion. We can bridge that gap. So those are few that we can start by doing, and setting an example. My country has done that. We have registered almost by February 2026. Tanzania have registered 408 companies through GECC, and we have, for example, for skillful youth, we have the Lubam workshop at Yared University, and we are thinking of constructing a college for which will produce the certificates and the diploma technical personnel. So through those initiatives, other governments also can chip in, so that these 2 years, this window for 2 years will be grasped very well. Thank you for now. That is my contribution.
Thank you very much, Ms. Mary. I think very on point. Skill development, building up the industrial base through special economic zones, leverage on the African Continental Free Trade area. It also has come up a bit, because I have a question on that I will try to ask because of what the ambition of the AFTA is, and now how do we situate the whole boosting to African trade in the context of this zero tariff with China, right? So there's a lot of, and I think you gave an example that fits in about how they can actually complement, right? So, co-aggregating of production of the continent in among us, resources from each country, which is also part of boosting AFTA, right? And then, of course, producing any access to China, because you're part of 53 countries, and I think it makes sense, right? Thank you very much. I'll go to Mikatekiso since he has a short time, then before I come to Professor Jinjie. So, Mikatekiso, I have a question about political economy perspective, right? We understand the gap that exists between policy announcement and how implementation is really on the ground, right? So I want to pick your thought politically. What do you think will be some of the biggest institutional or governance challenges from the perspective of Africa to either propel us or not, to take advantage of this opportunity? Briefly, okay, just maybe under 2 minutes. Yeah.
Okay. Africa has got many challenges. Where governance is concerned, especially institutional architecture, to support governance imperative on the African continent. I mean, let's take a look at firstly the tax collection. For instance, you have illicit financial flows, and so on and so forth. Then there's issues such as the ability to negotiate and manage contracts, and negotiate and manage projects, and such partnerships. That is a challenge that we've been picking up in our research at the Institute for Global Dialogue in recent years. So there's some of these, constraints, that, Africa continues to face, however, there is, a light at the end of the tunnel. For example, you have an Africa that has a growing middle class.
Yeah.
It's an Africa that has, a majority young population, right? So it's got, skilled, workforce, that, is, on the up and up, on the African continent. By 2050, Africa will have a population of 2.5 billion. That's a significant market on its own, right? And so on and so forth. These are some of the pluses, that, come, to the fore. But governance challenges, will, make, sort of stifle, the potential, of, this, youth dividend, if you like. If we aren't able to monitor properly the inflows and outflows of products and incomes, if we aren't able to manage properly the investment in the infrastructure that is needed to support these inflows and outflows of incomes and so on. These are some of the challenges that are well documented on Africa's situation, that it could certainly be benefit from continuing to work fairly diligently to resolve some of these issues. Big example. So we have this policy, zero tariff policy from China. How about to support this, something by way of improving the logistics architecture on the African continent to move goods and people around, right? Also in support and to take advantage of this, because remember, if you have some of these policies, you ought to be able to leverage them to build your productive capacity, your innovative capacity, and so on and so forth. We should be looking at using this this and others opportunities to build capacities in those particular spaces. So governance is literally at the heart and core of all of this, without which won't be able to do it. Lastly, before I go, my brother, a lot has been said about leadership, which is a major component, of this governance, that we're talking about. Do we have, the sufficient, or the correct, or the kind of quality leadership, required, to propel a, fit for purpose, a governance, of African affairs, internal and external, affairs. These are major questions that, Africa has to answer. And, whether or not you have an AU that is effective, there are many, questions, about that, as well. But it's a work. Africa is still a work in progress. I think it has a lot of progress. It's got what is it? Potential. Its potential is well documented, and it needs, I suppose, the correct leadership. Agent leadership, to drive, take advantage of opportunities such as this with China, and other partners, to drive, this agenda of self-reliance and, development of productive capacity, and so on and so forth. After all, the 2.5 billion, where are they going to find work?
Yeah.
And so on by 2050. So we have to build, this productive capacity and self-reliance.
Okay. Thank you very much, Mikatekiso, for that perspective. I'll be asking my question to Professor Jinjie, and then we'll zoom into the questions that already been brought in, and then we try to go around quickly in 2 minutes or so. So, Professor Wang, Jinjie, I wanted to ask from, of course, we all know, I mean, we of course, Africa wants to take advantage of this opportunity to engage, to do more with China. But and as you said, it's beyond market access, which is a tariff, which is a non-tariff barrier, right? So we need to look at a non-tariff barrier. So I'm just wanted to find out, from Chinese market perspective, what do you see as the non-tariff barriers that African exporters or government might pay attention if they really want to take advantage of this opportunity. Thank you.
So thank you, Paul. If I understand your question quite well, I think that's echoed to one of the questions from the audience. They were
Okay.
asking something. I think you were asking the same thing, but in a different way. One of the audience were asking, this is a great initiative. Please, does this zero tariff policy benefits China in
And
any way?
yes,
Right?
how?
I don't know if that's what you're asking me about, or how, or do you want me to answer this
Yeah, so
question or
maybe let me add that together with the question that talks
yeah,
about non-tariff barrier. So below that, you see, it's important to also address non-tariff policy on product and goods, which most Africa and China remain vulnerable on the global market in terms of standard compliance. So maybe you can tie that to that and the two, and then maybe just
yeah,
keep.
sure. I think that's because I think this is just the same question, just from different
Yeah,
aspects. How do you
yeah,
look at it? Is it from the China side or is from the African sort of side?
yeah.
How about let me answer this question because I think that's might be a question can relate it to your question at the same time. When we are looking at this zero tariff policy. Of course, for Professor Tang and our two colleagues from Africa also mentioned how does that benefit Africans, and also there are barriers out there. We all see that quite clearly. So from something we haven't covered is how from the China's point of view, we talked a lot about benefiting the African continent. How does that benefit China in a way? Because this strategy is it seems a zero tariff for African countries, 53 African countries. But actually, when we take a closer look at this policy, it is a strategic, a win-win design in many ways. Now let's from the China's side to explain this issue a little bit further to let our African colleagues.
Let me,
Yeah. So I think first
there's
of
a,
all is yeah.
if I,
Sorry.
Mikatekiso is leaving us. So thank you very much, Mikatekiso. We'll keep in touch and hopefully we can have you on another session. Thank you.
Uh,
Okay. Okay.
Fantastic stuff. Thank you so much,
Thank
colleagues.
you for
Sure.
sorry for interruption. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Sure. Okay. I may go on. Yes, wonderful. I think the first for China's side is when we are looking at China's has been heavily depend on Africa's raw materials for its manufacturing sector, right? That's the reality. And let's take Democratic Republic of Congo as an example. We see they provided probably over 70% of global cobalt supplies, essentials for China's battery and electronics industries. So this zero tariff policy strengthens China's long-term access to these critical mineral. Of course, this is a very much win-win. So we see China faces a significant strategic vulnerability due to the heavily reliance on the Africans' raw materials. So this is actually I just read this news. It's from one of the Chinese analysis. They said this thing. So for especially amid the geopolitical competition with the some Western countries. So China imports these raw materials or related products from sub-Saharan African countries annually. We see this would help secure the supply chain by creating a stronger economic interdependence. Another thing is because in our school, we not only have a economics school, but we also have business school. Lately, a lot of business school students, they came to us to ask about the investment opportunity in Africa. So they see this as zero tariff, not only see it as Africa export goods to us, but also as them, the demand market in China is shrinking, and we see that we are facing the economic challenge as well. So the Chinese domestic managers, entrepreneurs, they try to create a new markets for Chinese investment. So this actually creating the new markets for Chinese investment and exports. So the policy creates very powerful incentives for Chinese entrepreneurs, enterprises to establish the processing facilities in Africa as trade, some of the trade experts and also some of the investors, they all mentioned the Chinese firms could have stronger incentives to set up processing bases in Africa, right? Conducting the deep processing using local raw material, then export the finished products to Chinese tariff-free, to China's tariff-free. So you see, when we talk about lack of capacity and skill formation, the barriers to implement this policy. This is how we cannot rely on the local government or the African countries themselves to develop naturally by themselves. They need international partners to build up, to attract more investment to African countries. So Chinese investors, they would go to the related countries, and then they have industry parks related, and they created the business there. And during this international business encounters, we see the technology transfer. Actually, we already have data showed that we studied the Ethiopian local entrepreneurs. We noticed that 40% of the local entrepreneurs from Ethiopia, they actually used to work in the foreign companies. And most of the foreign companies means the Chinese company, because 70% of the foreign companies in Ethiopia are Chinese companies. So we see this international encountering, the investment encountering actually is one of the best mechanism to conduct a technology transfer, spillover effects. And this strategy allows Chinese, no matter state-owned enterprises, but also private companies, while they were struggling with the declining domestic demands, they find new markets, right? The investment opportunities, and that China can export machineries, equipment, and technology to Africa while simultaneously securing processed inputs, which is the tariff-free. At the same time, like Rosemary mentioned, we connect the Chinese enterprises, they work with a local company, they work with a local school, local educational institute to create a certification programs, to create a standardized for the evaluation of the products. So I believe these kind of investment opportunity for Chinese to invest in an African country would increase based on this zero tariff policy. Okay, Paul, let me stop here.
Thank you very much for that. I want to bring in Professor Tang. If you're still with us, there's a question that I wanted to see if I can pick your insight on. So I think it's from Ms. Sharon. I think Sharon, she's with China Daily. I think there's a three-part question, but I'm more interested in the second part of the question, which is how does China's zero policy tariff reflect the evolving role of South-South cooperation? I think one of the area argument that we've been made from some of our policy briefs about how this policy reflects in the broader scheme of South-South cooperation in promoting more inclusive global trade. And so the question is, how does this policy reflect the evolving role of South-South cooperation from what you said?
Yeah, I think the spirit of South-South cooperation is equality and mutual beneficial. Yeah, because we actually China doesn't provide much aid in the South-South cooperation. The majority is actually through the business like commercial loans and also investment. But in fact, zero tariff it counts as aid. It's called a trade for aid. Yeah, but however, I think for China, the real importance of this zero tariff is not to like provide aid, but China wants it to just become like a trigger or kickoff for some further trade and investment. This is how I understand it. Because if you just think it's like a trade for aid, then AGOA, EBA, actually, they have, after 20 years, they also had a very little effects. And what's important, I think, throughout the discussion and from the audience contribution, we can see that you all understand a lot of the constraints come from this Africa's own like industrial capacity, from infrastructure and so on. So therefore, then what we need to do in this South-South cooperation is actually to look for long run. So that's also my suggestion for this talk. Then for this question, the South-South cooperation, that's not only like China give that as a more like a opportunity, not like conditioned a charity. So and also then from this is actually to encourage more sustainable development. So this is also for the sustainable development, that means we need to see it for quite a long period. So for the short term, it's true that the agriculture products they may benefit first, and also then the capacity may constrain most of the this exports. So we cannot expect like an explosion of trade in maybe next 3 or 5 years. But actually, when we look in the long run, then perhaps this policy set a framework which let us think, talk, and then act. So I think this our today's workshop is just a part of this actions, actually trying to get more from this policy. So this policy is actually, I would say, it's a rather open question. So we do not have existing answers, since if we look only like some like historical proven records, then that will be relatively limited. But if we think South-South cooperation as something large, as something in the long term, then we can actually imagine and we can think a lot of possibility, like Professor Wang just mentioned, on how this investment can cooperate. Also, like different countries within this African continent free trade agreement, they may also then connect it with the zero tariff. So they combine different initiatives to work together. None of these are really like at hand yet. So, but we can actually think and hope and then work on it. Yeah. So that's it.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Tan. I wanted to ask, there's someone asking, please, why was Eswatini excluded enjoying the benefit of this policy? Is it more political? Of course, obviously it's political because they don't have diplomatic relations with the Republic of China, the only country in Africa that does not have that, and of course, because they have other relationships, so it's not with China, the Republic of China, and the one China policy. So I'm sure it's of course a political decision at this stage, if I'm right. Yeah. So yeah. So there's a question here from Yelimsiu Ganatu from the Institute of Foreign Affairs of Ethiopia. And there is about 3-part question. So I'm thinking I'll share it among our panelists that we have now. So it says China's policy shift from a predominantly infrastructure focus engagement towards strengthening trade partnerships and expanding market access for African export represent a major milestone. Can this zero tariff initiative be viewed as China's equivalent response to initiatives such as AGOA? That is one question. I know who to ask this question to. The question 2 is about which strategic sector should African countries prioritize to maximize the benefits of China's zero policy tariff and enhance export diversification, industrial transformation. How can so I'm going to ask Rosemary to answer the second question, and then Professor Jinjie will answer the third question, and then Professor Tang will answer the AGUA question. So I'll start with Rosemary, if you can. So what sector should countries in Africa prioritize if you really want to take advantage? Maybe you can use the example of Tanzania, what your country is doing, what has been the new direction? Has there been any new shift in terms of since the rounds? What has been the discussions in Tanzania now from the government perspective? Maybe that can be used as a case. Yeah, briefly. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Paul. To maximize these benefits, we must look beyond the raw materials, as I have said before, in order to prioritize on high yield. We need to go for green energy supply chain. So with the zero tariff on minerals like graphite and lithium, countries like Tanzania, we should stop exporting the raw ore and prioritize on mineral beneficiation, so that we can we can have processing hubs for battery grade materials, so that we can feed into China's global EV leadership. And also we should go with the modern agro processing, that we move from exporting the raw sesame, cocoa, horticulture, to exporting refined oils, chocolate, branded retail ready products, like the hero products we have from our southern highlands in Tanzania, in Iringa and the other regions. We have avocados. We should be backed up. They should be backed up by cold chain technology to reach the Chinese Tier 1 cities, not to export them as raw fruit. And also we should engage ourselves in light manufacturing and textiles. As I've said before, as the labor costs in China rise, Africa should have special economic zones, and we should target on outsourcing manufacturing. Zero tariff will allow us to produce apparel and household goods that are instantly price competitive within the Chinese market. So taking an example of my country, those are the three areas where we can concentrate, and then we can have we can prioritize and have a high yielding pillar to reach the Chinese market. Thank you
very much. I'll go to Professor Jinjie on the third part of the question. Of course, yeah, I know you did a research in Ethiopia. You visited the last time EV. I wanted to find out from you the question about landlocked, like Ethiopia. We have the Eastern Industrial Zone. There are a lot of Chinese manufacturing base there. They export strictly to Europe and America and all of that. So looking at the landlocked situation of countries like Ethiopia, which of course zero tariff means that you want to export more to China, and saying that logistical infrastructure connectivity constraint. I know there's a Djibouti Addis Ababa railway, which has come to, so in the broader sense, the other landlocked countries, more like expanding on the case of Ethiopia, how do you see these countries be able to take advantage of this policy? Briefly, yeah.
Yes. Thank you, Mr. Paul, and also thank you for our Ethiopian scholar for this great question. Yes, I think landlocked or non-landlocked, when they are facing the zero tariff policy, definitely there are some differences, because once you're landlocked, there are some logistical constraints there compared with those are non-landlocked. When we are looking at not only Ethiopia, but when we're looking at Africa in general, landlocked African countries, they all face the transportation costs like nearly like half, 50% higher than the global averages. So, but however, Ethiopian and other landlocked nations, they actually have there might be some strategic solutions solutions for them. As Paul, you just mentioned the Ethiopia-Djibouti Railway, right? It's over 750 some kilometers electrified railways in Ethiopia, lifeline, right? But we wanted it to be the full capacity to work, but nowadays it hasn't really full capacity. It used to be committed to prioritizing Ethiopian cargo, right? Especially for agricultural products like fertilizer to avoid congestions. However, when we're looking at Ethiopia not only has China as an investor. Professor Tang just mentioned a very good point. We have talked about zero tariff. It seems a issue only between China and African countries, but actually no. It is a zero tariff policy for all the different countries and partners, plus China and African countries. When we see in Ethiopia, we have Chinese investors, we have Indian investors, now we have UAE investors, and a lot of Turkish and some many more. So those investors from the other countries, they also would utilize this zero tariff policy to invest in the related area, then export because it's made in Ethiopia. It's gonna zero tariff exported to China. So we see it's a great opportunity, and not only would so I will wrap that really quick. First of all, we see Ethiopia has already have these Djibouti and Ethiopia railway. It hasn't been fully utilized. There is the transportation ready, so that's made the landlocked country has an advantage compared with other countries. Secondly, Ethiopia has the second largest country with the populations in Africa. So you have a good manufacturing foundations. And nowadays, you probably would attract more investors from all over the world who wanted to fully utilize the zero tariff to start manufacturing. You have the probably around the African countries have the most industry parks. So that will all set up the very good infrastructure foundations for you to think how the policy can attract more investors, global investors, not only Chinese investors. Yes, Paul, let me stop here.
Yeah, thank you very much. I'm going to bring in Professor Tan then to take the first part, which is talking about if this is China's response to like agua. Should I just even tie that to
Okay, yeah.
other-
It may look similar, but actually, China's tariff policy goes beyond AGOA because, as I said, on the one hand, the zero tariff policy has no string attached, unlike the AGOA for Ethiopia is actually pending on its political, like how compliance to the U.S. policy, and. Also, then on the other side, actually, China's capacity as an industry powerhouse make the potential of this policy distinct from the agua. Agua is just like purely opening the market, but in fact, when Africa doesn't have this capacity, then we see the outcome is limited. And even when Ethiopia was able to export some textile, some footwear to the U.S., it's just a very like a lower end of this whole industry. But China actually has a whole industry value chain. So that's what I think China's zero tariff policy, it will actually rather encourages some integration of value chain instead of just opening a market. Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think there's a comment here from Ernest Tambo, if I say that. Say implementation remain a major barriers across both sides based on experience and requires urgent attention. Should China wish to benefit from the new zero tariff policy due to complex governance in some African countries? This requires regional bloc engagement in customs compliance, rules of origin tracking, and capacity building programs for zero tariff operationalization milestones and success. And I think that has come up because some of the questions that's running through here is about like somebody anonymous asked that don't we think that countries in Africa need to also address issues of standards and compliance with China in line with this zero tariff policy, right? Obviously, those are the non-tariff barriers that we did raise earlier. That indeed, yes, tariff is a cost component, is a tax component, but there are other standard and compliance and certification and packaging that also needs to be brought in. Of course, that from what we say to also require there's collaboration with China to support countries that are signed on to the program to be able to meet that standardization and other non-tariff barriers, because obviously it will be very much in the interest of both parties that countries that are signed on to the policy also understand and can build the capacity of their business to take advantage of the policy. I would like to bring in, and this will be maybe my last round of questions because we are almost time. Rosemary, I just wanted to find out from an African perspective, if you look at this policy in the long-term, way, so looking at it, what will success actually look like, for Africa in 5 years from now if these opportunities properly utilized? Because as Professor Tang mentioned, like even the component of AGOA when it was implemented, but 80% being raw export of raw materials, and of course we do not want. That's not a story that we want to repeat. So in this case, so if you look at it policy, I mean, what will success look like for you, briefly? Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Paul. Since implementation of these things which are being said is hard for African countries, now it's time for China, if they really want to help us to move from aid to trade so that we can trade with them. Instead of just negotiating customer protocols with the 53 different times, China should deepen engagement with the regional bloc like EAC, ECOWAS, and things like those. So that speaking with the region instead of a country, it will help us as African continent to really grasp this opportunity, and from there we can have really success. And at least one day I can have products which are written made in Africa instead of made in China. Everything is made in China. At least one day can have a succession story that through the zero tariff, now the products are made in Africa, not made in China. And we should not only measure success solely by trade volume, but by institutional milestones. We need twinning programs where Chinese custom officials work alongside the African counterparts to harmonize the inspection and those SPS procedures. Also, capacity building must be decentralized. We need programs to train our local cooperatives on how to use the green lanes effectively so that we move from raw exports to value-added goods. So this, if will be done, we can have a truly succession story and success that one day we can China can support Africa countries in creating those trade facilitation task forces through domestic red tape to prioritize the zero tariff export. From there, if all these are being done, then we can say we have succeeded, we have success through the zero tariff policy, rather than praising ourselves now. We have increased the export by measuring only the trade volume. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Welcome, Professor Jinjie, to come in, and then Professor Tan will also come in. So there's a question from Kayembe, and I'll take that, and then of course you add your closing remarks as well. So about capacities, you did talk about it very much in your earlier submission, and of course I know you've done a lot of exchanges, so that's what I'm asking you. So the question is, there's an absence of capacity in Africa in sectors like science and technology. So the person wants to know, is it Chinese, whether China can can take deliberate steps to promote exchange visits and joint research by academicians from both regions so as to add value. I'm sure this is something that you've already addressed, but briefly, and then of course you can give your remarks as well. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think this is a question more related to educating the elites in the STEM area. When we Chinese have a saying, when you're educating people, it take a much longer time. Maybe it's a take 10 years to educate a person and 100 years for a tree. So it's really a long time for educating people. So that's why when we are looking at education, we cannot talk about education itself. Education sometimes Africa doesn't lack of education. Education has been in Africa, been from, since the international organizations, World Bank, IMF, UNESCO, they all have different education programs. And we have this Millennium Goals for education. Education is there. We don't lack of education, but we lack the appropriate education that meet the needs of industrialization. I think the zero tariff is a great opportunity. They bring up these industrialization opportunities, and because when we have a demand, then the supply side as education started to kicking off. So we used to always just look at a supply side. Okay, we educate more, give more to the children the knowledge. But if the knowledge doesn't connect with the reality, doesn't connect with the education, the knowledge doesn't actually work. So once we have the related requirements for certain industrializations, certain businesses, because we see it's a potential selling markets is out there. So the business side started to kicking off. Then the education would respond to it. What kind of person we needed, we need to train at. So we see this training cooperations between government, enterprises, and the local schools. That's very, very successful in Zambia. We visited Zambia last year. We see this training program initiated by the Chinese company and engaging the local government, because the local government provided some fundings for the youth to apply. So they have the fundings so they can study at these Chinese enterprises supported education. And also they work with the local organizations to facilitate those youth transfer smoothly from the training to the job sites, which is the Chinese companies. So you see that's a closed loop. Once we set up a model like this kind, no matter it's a science and technology and STEM, education always needed to combine together with the job opportunity and with the industry. I think that's what Africa needs the most. I think one of the audience has a question about the brain drain and the circulation. That's really echoes to that. When we're looking at Africa, years and years, we lost our smart minds, the talent minds. But if we have a very good policy, we see there's a big industry market in our country developed the upgraded industry chains, that's going to keep our youth stay in the country or even return. And a government has policy like Ghana, they have the diaspora return years. And many countries. So the government policy work together with the industry. When the youth, they see the hope of development, they returning back. So I think that's something will happen soon once we have settled down what kind of industry is the country should focus on. And then the education will matching with the industry. Then they're forming a healthy circle. All right.
Thank you very much, Professor Jinjie. I'll then take the final remarks from Professor Tang. Just what your concluding remarks will be here.
Okay. Yeah, I think Professor Jinjie or Professor Wang has already said all these excellent like ideas, and also as well as Rosemary and you. And I really enjoy the discussion. And I think, yeah, from the audience, I can see a lot of questions, and some are very eager, and some think yeah, for the long run. And I think it's good. We just have now all this knowledge and we have a discussion, but actually this is a practical policy, and what's important is really to do it, right? So, and this doing it doesn't just depend on several leaders, several enterprise, but it actually up to everybody on on the continent and also in China. We should all work on it and using this good policy and do each other's do work in the next decades. Even we are academics, then we can still contribute a lot to explain the consequence, to find out the bottleneck. And even if you are just like a student or a scholar, yeah, we can just bring our knowledge to the practice. But if you are practitioner, then just go ahead and try to turn this opportunity into the real benefits. So yeah, that's just would be my ending words. To work on after the workshop. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Professor Tang, Professor Jinjie, of course, Rosemary, and then Mikatekiso, who joined us earlier. On behalf of ACCPA, we say a big thank you to you for spending your evening with us. I know it's already nighttime in Beijing, and also late afternoon in Dar es Salaam, and of course Johannesburg, and we are in Accra. Thank you very much for making time, sharing your insight to that. And thank you to all the people that join us. Thank you for bringing your questions. We're sorry if you're not able to ask your question because of time constraint. But again, we still have access to our speakers. If you have any question that you'd like us to send it to them, we can do that. And you can engage them in that sense. And we appreciate all of you for joining. This session has been recorded. Of course, we will put it together and have it available on our YouTube channel as well for further viewing. And for us at the ACCPA, this is just the beginning of our engagement on this zero tariff policy in the broader Africa-China trade and economic cooperation. And we hope to come your way again soon with our future programs. And you can follow us on our website as you register for this event for other updates and other programs that we are doing, so that you can all be a part of it. Again, we are open to partnerships. So if you're doing anything that you think we can collaborate on, please do not hesitate to reach out to us, and we're happy to engage. Thank you, and we'll hope to see you all soon. Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Paul. Thank you,
you.
Rosemary.
Bye.
Thank you, Professor
Bye.
Tang.
Nice to
See
see you.
you.
Yeah, thank you. Bye.
Okay, thank you.